Welcome to this episode of the Swishes podcast. We hope you enjoy it. Okay, so we're here today with Ciaran Crossin, Michelle Wang, and Armin Scharlach, and myself, Bill Young. We're going to be talking about continuous development or continuous personal or professional development. Let's start with some background about how you got into your current careers. Armin.
I think we have to distinguish between a strategic plan and being open to what happens along that path. And as we all know, the best plans are the ones that you have not planned for. And let me explain that with a very personal example. I originally studied electric engineering, and I was never even thinking about doing consulting, but I had a very close friend which I shared most of the time at university with, and we worked together. He always wanted to go consulting. I wanted to go to marketing, and in the end it ended up right the opposite way. And the way how it did happen was that I, a year before I finished my studies, thought maybe now is the time to start testing this application process, writing a CV and seeing what happens there. And I found a job advertisement from Price Waterhouse for SAP consulting, submitted my application, was very positively surprised that they invited me for an assessment center. And after a full day of assessment center, out of 28 participants, they made 2 of us an offer. And one of them was me. That made me think maybe they had seen something in me that I wasn't even aware of myself, and thought maybe I should take this as a sign, and this is how I ended up in consulting. And I think that's the openness that I mentioned earlier that is so important, despite all the plans that you have done upfront.
Michelle, a word from you?
I came from completely different background. So I'm from China, and I grew up in China. I graduated from China University. So put things in perspective, this year, the university graduate number in China is 12 million. And that is 75% of eligible people of the same age. So to me, personal development or professional development is one way or one of the easiest way for you to stand out in any of the applications. So, I'm even getting a chef certificate, but don't record that. Cut. But just give you a perspective, the drive and purpose might be completely in a different context.
That's a very different culture from what I'm familiar with. Ciaran, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think I kind of had sort of the anti-career from Armin. I studied chemical engineering and I fell into it. Right, I really didn't know what I wanted to do at university. And I started at university doing physics. But because I couldn't get physics, chemistry and maths together in the university timetable, I sort of stopped doing that, and I then sort of randomly picked chemical engineering. I went along, met the faculty leader. He liked my A-level results, so then they took me into chemical engineering. But I'm sort of, how do I put this? I'm sort of an inner nerd. I have a high degree of nerdness in me.
I know that, Ciaran.
Yeah. And so I kind of went into engineering and sort of stayed in engineering, and sort of through my career, I've done a number of CPD sort of exercises, both personally at my own expense. I did a postgraduate diploma in international business management, and then I've done certain pieces of actual real education through companies that I've worked for. But I've never actually really felt the urge to move from doing engineering, because I'm kind of in a fat, dumb and happy rut, but it's a nice rut, and I can sit in there. And so that's kind of like the opposite, I think, of Armin's career. You got the degree in engineering and didn't do any of it, whereas I sort of got stuck into that one narrow field. And I've stayed there ever since. But I've also had some kind of very disappointing experiences with CPD. I don't know if any of you done PMI, the Project Management Institute?
I know of it, but I've not done it.
Right. Well, obviously, if this is going to go public, I need to be very careful with my words here. But I did that and became, got the kind of, I can't even remember the name of the qualification, but it was sort of the professional project manager. But then it was a constant rolling thing to maintain that qualification. And I felt kind of a little bit, I personally felt, this is my personal opinion, again, being careful, I felt a little bit aggrieved that I had to continue, obviously, to either buy things or do things with this institute or go to additional training courses to keep a qualification which they said I was good enough to have in the beginning. It's not like your university comes back to you every 3 or 4 years and says you need to sit these exams again.
I think we're going to come back to that because that's quite an important aspect of career training. There are quite a lot of institutions that lock you in for annual payments in order to maintain it.
Yeah, I don't mind the annual payment, but it was over and above the annual payment was the bit that left me feeling a little jaded with that process.
Right. Well, my background, I actually studied agriculture because I was fascinated by it as a teenager. Loved the whole concept of cattle, of animals, grass, crops. It was wonderful. And then I went on to, I decided at a very early age, there was no way I had the energy and the commitment to become a farmer. So I'd go into the commercial side of it. So that's where I started. Armin, you...
Very interesting. I didn't know that about you, Bill. And maybe if someone who is testing sports car on television can become a farmer, you can do it the other way around.
That's the only comparison between me and Jeremy Clarkson I've ever heard.
But coming back to Ciaran's point, particularly when we're talking about formal qualifications, I know that in today's world there is a need for formal qualifications, but I would actually dare the provocative thesis that it's only when you're doing something where there is an abundance of people and therefore HR is becoming the big filter before the real person will be looked at by the real decision makers. I recognize that when I look at CVs, I don't really care much about formal qualifications. I'm trying to better understand the person, his or her talents, his or her passions, because I think those are way more important, and how those are demonstrated and have been demonstrated in what he or she has been doing in the past. But obviously that is only possible if you look at 3-4 CVs and then have 2-3 interviews. But HR is in the miserable situation that if they sometimes have to go through dozens or hundreds of applications, they need to have some filter criteria. And then these formal qualifications do actually matter. But later in the interview, I don't care about these at all.
I totally agree with that. Most people who are rational will self-filter on their own applications. I'm not going to apply for a job as a brain surgeon. I'm going to apply for jobs where I feel I'm qualified to do the job. And then the rest of, you've got to somehow have a CV that gets through the rather, almost the rather harsh filtering process. But the interview process, and any interview process I've either participated in being interviewed or as the interviewer, it's always been answering the question of, will this person fit in here? Is this person going to be good to work with? Will they fit in?
I really want to hear from Michel on this one, because you hinted earlier that there's a more certificate-based culture that you've come from, where you present the certificates to show what you've done. And before I ask you to explain that a bit more, let me say that I went into a big company and I was very fortunate. After doing a commercial job for a few years, I sort of decided I wanted to move on to some sort of head office management role. And it just sort of happened after you express the desire. And I did that for a few years. And then someone said, would you like to go on a secondment? And I did that. And when I came back, the business was falling apart and I was able to change divisions. And I was thinking then, should I be doing an MBA? And it didn't make sense apart from the certificate, because I'd done a lot and I did not see the sense in doing an MBA on top of it. So I was in Ciaran's camp of saying, I know what I can do and I know what I can apply for and I don't need a certificate. But that's the culture I came from. And that's why I wanted to come to Michel. Armin, do you want to say something first?
I coincidentally talked earlier today to a good friend of mine who had placed a job advertisement on LinkedIn earlier this year, and he had received 25 applications for a sales position for procurement software. And he told me this morning he was really surprised that none of the people who applied had any sales experience. They were still shooting at more or less everything that is being posted on LinkedIn. So I think it also is an important factor how the economy in general, or at least in the very field of your expertise, is at the moment, if there is an abundance of people or not. Because if there are many people on the market seeking for jobs, you will probably see a lot of applications where people do not apply the rationale that you mentioned earlier, that you're not applying for brain surgery if you aren't one.
Well, yeah, Ciaran sort of indicated that there's a self-filtering device happening in his case, and obviously not in the 25 people who'd applied for a sales job. So there's a discussion to be had there. Michelle, are you okay to come in on this?
Thank you. To start with, I studied English literature. So at the statistic point of view, so we are like 3/4 of us didn't stick to what we originally started. But to build your point, my view of personal development or professional development is slightly different. I believe whatever we've done would contribute to what we are doing now. I studied English as a major. I currently work in the legal field, so the drafting is not a problem to me. So all the certificate I've done, because I'm being Chinese, I have probably a gazillion different certificates, you name it. And Ciaran is a PMP, I think Project Management Professionals, right, issued by the Institute of PMI. I've done similar courses also. So the purpose of when I'm doing it originally is to be able to stand out of the competition, right? But gradually it becomes a habit, because I believe whatever we do, it will be used somewhere in the future.
I'd like to hear more about the habit, and the reason is I do know of many people who have the habit and they want to go on a training course to take them into a different area, give them some extra knowledge, expand the breadth of their current knowledge. It seems about every 3 or 4 years. It's a hell of an investment in terms of downtime and as well as investment in the course. Armin, you'd like to come in, but I want to ask Michelle more about this as well.
It's response to what Michelle was saying, and I like the idea of naming it a habit, but I would think we should distinguish between the habit of continued learning and the habit to actually make, in the worst case, paid for certificates, development programs or trainings. Learning, I think we all agree, is something that is a lifetime need in any kind of job. I would just challenge whether it really always needs the certificates.
Oh, as a Chinese, I do.
But it's not just Chinese. The Germanic, Swiss and German, Austrian cultures, and I know those particularly well, they all are very certificate-based, and your CV must have originals of all of the certificates attached to the back, more or less. And that is very different from the UK culture, at least as I used to know it. Maybe it's changed since then.
No, I think the UK culture is still the same. That if you've written on your CV that you've got a Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Engineering, whatever it is, or a PhD, they'll take that as read up to the point of where you're about to sign a contract. Then they'll want to see the certificate. But that was something that surprised me here was, reading CVs that had, like, as you say, a booklet of certificates attached to them to kind of prove that this is the person and this is their qualifications. I can't say I felt it useful, or I can't say I felt it really distinguishing from the person just writing a few short lines on their CV saying, this is the education I've had.
Sorry, I've also moved away a little bit more from the certificate now. So at the moment, for example, even participating in this kind of podcast and discussions, right? And you're trying to post your opinions and discussions on LinkedIn, for example. And to me, that's all kind of like personal development. And there's also activities where we're doing involved with SIPs, other institute, trying to host the event to share learnings and building networks. I would say all those kind of things becomes more and more popular in my personal life, rather than just study for a certificate. Apart from my Cordon Bleu chef certificates, I still have 1 week to go.
Yeah.
Don't
I mean,
just
I would come in on what Michelle has said there. That's a very, very important point, the network. I think a lot of the benefits of continuing education, as long as it's not just a course that's ran in-house in your company, it's where you go out and you build a network of people from maybe different organizations and different experiences. And I think that, although we probably might get to it, I think that from what I've seen from people with MBAs and things like that, the big learning that they have is the expansion in their network, not necessarily just this kind of case studies in how to manage strategy within a company. It's the building of the network, I think, is one of the main values of that kind of continued education part.
Can I take you to the topic of actually doing degrees or MBAs or postgrad work or PhDs? These are big investments. A colleague of mine who didn't have a primary degree, he'd gone on to quite high levels in the company. He was very bright, ferociously good memory, and quite good, really quite good with people. And he said he wanted to do a degree. And I looked at him and didn't really understand why. It seemed that perhaps he was making up for not having had a primary degree earlier on. And he said, "What do you think I should do?" And I said, "Well, knowing you as I do," I said, "philosophy would be a good one." And he looked at me somewhat shocked. And he said, "I'd love to do philosophy, but that was so far from my mind. I was thinking of supply chain management." And I said, "No way, no way. You could be the professor of supply chain management."
Now, there clearly are jobs where you might need a degree in order to make it. But let's take those aside and let's take consulting as an example where I know myself a little bit around. And in most firms, without naming any, when you come with a PhD, you're not getting hired into the same rank as someone who has just done his normal grade, but one level up. But that one level up is what you can also accomplish in 1 or 2 years of good performance in that rank, and then you can do the math whether you can do your PhD in 2 years time, or whether it might be better to start a little bit earlier, except if you are seriously considering that an academic career might be the right thing for you, because then you need to make the PhD, but not necessarily for the business position.
A former chairman of a company I worked in is, pretty sure it was him, famous for saying, "I would never hire a chemist without a PhD, and I would never hire an engineer with one." And
John
it's
Harvey
a very,
Jones.
very profound thing to say because of the difference in the career paths. And if you've got an engineer, you really don't want to know someone who does quadrilateral equations that much. You want somebody who can integrate technologies and has done it.
I'm very, very familiar with that quote. But when it comes to the idea of formal education and not formal education, I think that's very individually based. I think mirroring your experience, Bill, I've known guys that have got to very senior levels in the company, in companies that started out maybe as apprentices on the maintenance tools, and because of their personality, because of their, call it for what it is, their individual brilliance, they've risen and outshone others. And then I've also known other people who have risen to a certain level, but because they didn't have the paperwork, were basically told, no, you can't go beyond that because you need to have the university education for that. And I've seen that. I've seen that. Sorry,
Michelle wants to come in, but I wanted to ask you, in what culture was that, Ciaran, where the paperwork suddenly halfway through their career, the lack of a certificate was important? Where was that?
I would rather not say.
Okay.
But I can say, because in Germany it applies very much if you're working in a public place, in a public position.
Similar, that was my grandpa in reality. So my grandpa was head of police of the whole province, one of the provinces in China, when he was only 30 years old. So he got up a very senior position in the military in China. However, he couldn't go any further because there's people saying, look, he didn't even get a primary school, formal education. But we're talking about probably 50, 60, 70 years ago at that time. I have slightly dilemma when it's come to this formal education, apprentice route or university. I still want my daughters go through formal university route. It's not only because of the knowledge they learn, right? It depends which subject they choose in the end. Because some of them you do need to have proper, like a medication and etc. But it's all about a thought process as well, whether you have this critical thinking and the way that, you look at things, the way you work with other people. That's, in my view, still very important, at least prepare you for, a real world in a way. And look at the audience here. We don't really, a lot of us, to actually take in what we've learned, really applied at work, in a sense. So it's how we continue to equip us to, like Armin, you said, it's a lifelong learning, the ability of, self-control, self-motivation, right, and self-drive, and that determination. That's what I think. I haven't gone through apprentice route. Of course, they probably also have that, teaching and learning experience through that way. But I think university formal education is also a proven way that, the students meant to learn from those things.
Isn't it easy to confuse what I think you've just described, Michelle, which is personal development, the way you think, with professional development, which is much more specific? I often think that personal development is empirical. It's about looking at the world and seeing how things work, being able to make comparisons of how this works or that works in different situations. Whereas professional development is more reductionist. It's about breaking things down to look in detail about how a process works in its specific parts, and then assuming that when you build all that up together that you've understood the whole thing. In your personal career, on a more empirical basis, you haven't understood the whole thing because you haven't understood how the parts react together in different circumstances, or how that system interacts with another system at a different time. That, I think, is personal development, which is very different from the professional development and the certificates to prove you know this, that, and the other, and put ticks in the right boxes. I'm not sure if I've made sense with that, but...
You did, and I'm not sure whether I probably divert this conversation to another angle. But if I may tag on you on this one. So from the book Outliers, written by Malcolm Gladwell, he said, if you do everything, over 10,000 hours, you'll be an expert in that. So in a way that you have to have that personal development, the drive, and to do that amount of hours so that enhance your professional development.
A lot of people have taken him to task over that, but I happen to think he was really accurate on that. Armin?
I think, and that resonates a bit with this, because if you have the willingness to spend 10,000 hours on something, you're not doing it because you have to, but you're only doing that because you want to. And that actually leads to my, maybe again, a little bit provocative statement. When I look at a CV, or when I sometimes talk to my nieces and nephew and they want to get some ideas how to organize their career, I'm always telling them, the first thing you should look at is, what is your talent? Because if you have a talent, and I'm pretty sure everyone has, sometimes people don't know which it is, but I'm pretty sure everyone has. If you have a talent that distinguishes you from the others, that's such a big plus that the others, even if they learn a lot, cannot really compensate. If you are not aware of that, then look where you have passion. Because if you have an application from someone who is really passionate about what this job is about, you will listen more carefully to what he or she has to offer, and you will consider his or her application much more intensively than from someone who might have the formal qualification but is not really an inspiring person. The least important from these factors is prior experience, and this is where qualification does matter, but for me it is the weakest in that cascade of three elements that really make a person shine out of the others in a certain
really, Armin,
role.
you're putting personal experience at the bottom of those three.
I would put talent first, passion second, and experience third.
Wow. Need to think about that for a while.
I need to rewrite my CV.
Because you mentioned it, Ciaran, the CVs that I have been using in my life were structured very different to most of the others. Instead of the traditional setup, I provided a super brief table of just the companies and when I had been working with them, because that already tells a lot about a person when you see which companies they have worked for. And then I typically organized my CV in a short table where I was breaking down what are the competencies that are needed in order to be successful in the role that you're looking to hire someone for. And then in the second column, I provided where I have demonstrated having these competencies that are needed. And that has worked out pretty well, I must say.
Please share a copy. I haven't got a CV yet.
I would not be on that page, Armin. I think inquisitiveness, curiosity has always been a big driver of mine. And I don't think I've ever been guilty of being passionate about anything. It's the curiosity and the opportunities to discover new things that has led me into areas where I hadn't thought about passion as having anything to do with it.
So, Bill, if I can just say, so you have a passion for discovery?
I certainly am inquisitive and curious. Whether it's a passion for it or not, I don't know, Ciaran.
But I mean, I think if you break it down, passion is just another word for an emotion, a desire.
Yeah. So, what is it that drives people to? What about? Would any of you taken 2 years or 3 years out to do something completely different out of your career? No. I had a heart attack once, and it was a very minor one. And after a month out on a sort of recuperation, I was a different person. I began to understand why some people insist on having 4 or 5 weeks holiday in one go. And after 2 months, I had a different perspective on the world. And it did just seem to me that working in a company doing roughly the same thing for a long period of time is very narrowing. And my another formative experience, apart from changing jobs from time to time, was going and working for a consulting company quite late in my career. And suddenly I was with a lot of younger people. I was being sent off on courses with them. And I did query it and said, are you sure you want to invest in me? Because I won't be with you as long as these guys will. I can't help, the biological process of aging. But they didn't think about it. They just sent me off on courses, gave me new challenges. And it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And since then, if anyone's asked me, about doing consultancy, I've said, do it. Take the chance to work for a consulting firm because you get better training, you get all these different experiences. It seemed to me to be such a wonderful learning opportunity.
The reason why I ended up in consulting, but I also would, as you just were saying, would recommend everyone spending some time at least in consulting is most people that I have met in their mid-20s, early 30s do not really know yet what their particular talent and or passion is. And that's why consulting makes so much sense, because consulting puts you in a role where you're having to do so many different things that it gives you a wonderful chance to find out where you have that talent or passion.
To just build on that, one of the things that I'm kind of jealous of, and quite jealous of my daughter, because hopefully she will go to university. I'm trying to point her towards that, and then what she does after that is entirely her affair. But the current working world, and this has been since, I guess, the start of the millennial generation, is that those guys are doing a job for a year, 2 years, and then they're off, and they're maybe completely changing industries, completely changing job types, doing something else for a couple of years, something else for a couple of years, and they seem to, always be able to, kind of like bounce around the squares on the chessboard. And I've never had that experience, and in some ways I'm a little jealous of it.
That's my perception of the current world of work as well. It seems a lot of people share that opinion. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know. So if you're bouncing around the place and you've got all these different experiences with different companies, to my original way of thinking, that is better than formal qualifications where you're just learning stuff, real life experience. However, if you're an employer and you're looking at somebody who's done this and done that, done the other, isn't there a need for some little certificate just to show that they have some grounding in something? So my question is, does this modern lifestyle reduce the requirement for formal qualification or increase the need for some sort of certificate to show that you have got something in there and they don't have to dig it out?
I think it just depends on the job. I don't think experience completely removes the need to have that kind of fundamental, educated understanding of a particular subject area, but I think it's job by job. But I can certainly see with millennials how it builds their character, and how they do have not necessarily a depth, but a breadth of experience. And what is it they say? Sometimes quantity has a quality all of its own, which I would not necessarily have. I mean, I've effectively been in 2 companies my entire career so far, touch wood.
There's a German saying, I'm not sure how it translates really correctly into English, that paper is patient. And therefore, when you have these on a CV, they are, whether you have them or you have not, is pretty meaningless until you really learn about the person. That comes back to what I said from the very beginning, that it's clearly is different whether you are in competition with many, and therefore some formal filtering applies before you have a chance to show yourself as a person, or whether you have that chance directly. Now, there is one thing that is special in Switzerland that I very much like, and I think it's the most effective way to find out about a person without spending too much time and effort up front, and that is to ask for a reference and have a 10-15 minutes call with the former employer with that reference, and depending on who that person is and what this person tells you about your candidate, tells you significantly more than what you will ever find in their CV.
And I think that's why company has graduate scheme. So I started with Rolls-Royce graduate scheme, where I moved around, different regions, different areas, really give me a good visibility of how the whole company operates in the various different areas, even outside procurement or supply chain management. And I believe at the very early stage of the career is very valuable to be able to see as wide as possible. But also I believe that at some point, we need to go vertical as well, that then we build that necessary to become the expert, I don't know the better word, in what we do, right? Or to be good at what we do in the end.
To go vertical, as you put it, are you implying that that's the one that needs some certificates?
I would say later stage of the career, certificate would have much less value add at a very or at the early stage of the career.
So what's your views on, because when people talk about continuous, whether it's personal or professional development, they're quite often thinking of courses that you organize yourself, and not just as a post-grad thing, but as something you do to your late 20s, 30s, into your 40s, maybe 50s and beyond, and that every few years you look at doing something to expand your horizons, to take yourself out of the rut, which I think Armin referred to earlier. That is a common belief now, that is the way to go forward. Is it correct? Is that absolutely sensible or not?
I would not say whether it's correct or not correct, but I would add to it, saying also giving something back, right? Put yourself into it, give yourself the time. As you said, build the curiosity, the willingness to learn, the willingness to share. In my view, that's a big part of either personal or professional development.
You're looking very thoughtful, Armin.
It made me think one of the things that I have been teaching my mentees for a very long time when they struggle with the heavy workload that you typically have in consulting, that whenever they find themselves in front of a long night of work, they should ask themselves a couple of questions. And the very first question is relevant and for our discussion here. And that is the question to challenge yourself. Is the way how I am intending to do this very task that I have in front of me already the most intelligent one? Because it's based on what you have learned so far, and maybe it is helpful to ask the people around, I need to do this, I would do it this and this way, would you do it the same way, or are there better ways to handle that task? And I think that is that curiosity and that willingness to challenge yourself on a constant basis to learn about more things that otherwise you wouldn't have had ever on your radar. I think we all agree the most important things are to learn about things you do not know that you do not know them.
Are we all sure that managers and employers want to be questioned and challenged? I agree with Armin, everything Armin said, but I do have that question hanging.
I mean, I agree with what Armin has said as well. There's in English, the saying is there's more than one way to skin a cat, as horrible as that phrase actually is. But in any single situation, there is always a best way to do things with the consensus of sort of the people in the room at that time. I've known quite a lot of managers that don't want to be questioned, don't want their particular method or manner kind of questioned, and it's an unfortunate sort of downside of any role in any company, that there will be managers who, I'll be controversial and say this, who probably shouldn't be in position. A manager is there to manage things for the people that are doing the work.
Yeah, we could get into management. That might be a different podcast.
Yeah.
But that reminded me on a personal story where I was in the receiving situation getting a very uncomfortable feedback, and it made me struggling for a bit to digest it. But then fortunately, I think derived the right consequences from it. I was a consultant very specialized on advanced sourcing, leveraging advanced analytics, combinatorial optimization engines. And there were only a few people on this planet who were that deep in these methods than I was at the time. And then I had a discussion with one of the senior partners in the company that I was working for at that time. And he actually told me, Armin, just because you have an admittedly very sharp and powerful hammer in your hands, the world isn't full of nails. And as I said, it made me swallow that and it made me think. And I wasn't not necessarily super happy about it at the first glance. But then after a little bit further consideration, I recognized what he tried to tell me. And was actually the point where I then got someone with game theory experience in my team, and that opened a complete new toolbox and methods to myself that I wasn't even aware of that it would exist prior to that comment. So it does help a lot, even if it feels uncomfortable.
That manager's comment feels like a valid criticism of an awful lot of training at all levels. They're giving you a specific tool, and in possession of that tool, that hammer, everything looks like a nail, regardless of what it is. And I think from what I was trying to get to earlier, if you're more curious and you say, well, is this the right tool? What other tools have I got? Does this need a tool that I haven't even thought of yet, that hasn't been invented? It takes you to a completely different place than a formal course with a certificate at the end showing that you know which boxes to tick can. So I had to throw that in because of the profundity of your statement. I shouldn't have tried to top it, should I? So sorry.
My mom always says, if you don't want to help anyone, don't point out their mistakes. So anyone saying anything to me, I would receive this gratitude. Of course, I'm not saying I'm saint and I'm not reacting the way I will be regretting in later on. But I think, everyone is deserving having their own opinion. And as a Chinese, I don't mind people sending me the courses. That's another certificate.
That's wonderful. I love the breadth of background here. Oh, by the way, when it comes to getting feedback, just a quick anecdote. I'm not even sure it's relevant. The company had just introduced 360-degree feedback. So he was with his manager, and his manager had just given him his annual assessment. And then his manager said, now, under these new instructions, guidance, he said, I'm to ask you what you would say to me. What feedback can you give me as an employee to their manager? And David duly fed back to his manager how he thought he could improve. And his manager started going, the reason I did that was, etc., trying to justify himself. And David just leaned across the desk and put his hand on his forearm. And he said, Dieter, you just have to say, thank you for the feedback. We should come to a close now. Any thoughts? I'll go around everyone in the room. I'll start with Ciaran.
Well, my final thoughts are, I see there is, for continual professional development, things like that. I mean, it's been immensely valuable to me in my field, although I've stayed quite narrow in my field. I think it's immensely valuable, but then, I view myself, maybe not necessarily others may not agree with this or not. I view myself as a learning machine. I've always considered myself to be a lifelong learner. So, like Michelle and the desire for certificates, I think it's the same thing, but I don't necessarily need the certificate to put in the file later on.
Right. Armin.
I think it doesn't really matter how good you are as a planner and strategist for your career. You will always benefit from exchanging thoughts with others. And this is why I enjoyed our today's conversation a lot. And I actually have taken at least one very concrete thing from it with me, where, as I mentioned earlier, that so far I had been looking for talent, passion, and then experience. I think I will now add curiosity to that list. I'm not perfectly sure at what rank, but I will add it to the list.
So 4, getting dangerously close to the limit of 5, Armin. But and Michelle?
So some thoughts from me to end this podcast. Always trying to be a better version of yourself every day. It would be great if you could start something that is interesting in your career. But if you couldn't, just stay there long enough until it becomes interesting.
Wow. There's been an awful lot of philosophy in today, for which I'm extremely grateful. And I've come to the conclusion that we're all lifelong learners, and that lifelong learners is more a state of mind than a list of certificates pinned to a CV. And for that, I'm very grateful to you. Thank you, Michelle, Armin, Ciaran, from myself, Bill. Till the next time. Thank you all. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Swishoes podcast.